Welcome to the Bible Forum. I'm Warren Sprouse. Thanks to Bruce, Caitlyn Jenner, and many others, we're now all familiar with the concept of being transgender. But what about being transabled or transracial or trans species or trans age? Are any of these valid? Any of these real? Or are all of them, including transgender, based primarily on mental and emotional disorders? The question of being trans age, referring to someone who feels he or she is a child trapped in an adult's body, was recently in the news with this shocking headline: Trans age. Pedophile charged with abusing 3 girls, claiming he's a 9-year-old trapped in a man's body. Now, putting aside the inexcusable nature of this man's alleged crimes, he's hardly the first to make such a claim. Consider the story of another married man with 7 children who now lives as a 6-year-old girl with his new adoptive parents. And then there are those who identify as transabled. The headline explains it: becoming transabled by choice, not chance. Transabled people feel like imposters in their fully working bodies. Apparently, people like this are tormented by their healthy bodies, feeling the compulsion to be crippled or without a hand or to be blind. Some have even frozen a foot until it had to be amputated, sawed off their own legs, literally, or blinded themselves, all in a desire to find inner peace and wholeness. And once the gory job is done, they're thrilled with their radical choices. And then there are those who identify as transracial. Wikipedia defines this as individuals who claim to have a racial identity that differs from their birth race. Think Rachel Dolezal. And then there are those who identify as trans species, like the young woman who lives her life as a cat. There was a story by Daniel Greenfield on Front Page magazine dating back to 2013 that addressed this growing phenomenon. But as Greenfield noted, the transgender community was not too happy with him. You see, he wrote, like most newly minted civil rights groups, trannies are intolerant of trans species Americans, accusing them of only pretending to think that they're cats, and playing the old "how dare you compare your pain with my pain and your imaginary identity with my imaginary identity" game. So how are we to know? And therein lies the problem. There is no more a test to prove that someone is or is not transgender than there's a test to prove that someone is or is not transabled, transracial, transage, or trans species. When all are detailed neurological studies required before someone has sexual surgery, when are chromosomal tests required before a child is put on puberty blockers or given hormones. If it is far from ideal to mutilate healthy body parts to accommodate someone who identifies as transabled, then it's also far from ideal to do the same for someone who identifies as transgender. Now, in regard to being trans species, the transgender community wants to be compassionate, recognizing the validity of what others perceive as reality. However, at the same time, not a few of them have said things like, but there's a big difference between some of us really do have brain that are male or in female bodies or vice versa. But no human being has a leopard's brain or a wolf's brain. And they're right. It's true. But it does raise the question, Where's the test? How do we differentiate the case of someone who identifies as transabled? What's the difference between a mind map telling someone that their left hand shouldn't be there and someone who believes she's a woman trapped in a man's body? Now, the author of this article, Daniel Greenfield, had this to say about that. He says, it's not just a mental illness. It's also an identity. Men in dresses claim that gender is in the mind, not in the body. If you think you're a woman, you are. What used to be a minor form of eccentric insanity has now become educational policy in our schools. Now, in my reality, all of that is insane. It's insanity. And it's clearly insane. But Daniel asked, why stop at gender when you can also do species? There are people who believe their true identity is that of an animal. And who's to say that species isn't in the mind? Just like the gender is in the mind. That this is not just a thought experiment or a satire. That this is reality. Now, species dysphoria, a profound state of unease or dissatisfaction, is the equivalent of gender dysphoria. Mentally ill persons with gender dysphoria are fashionably diagnosed with gender identity disorder. There is, as of yet, no species identity disorder, but that is no doubt coming. And as yet, he notes, Daniel, like those who identify as transgender, transspecies Americans create special pronouns for themselves and insist that refusing to pretend they're cats or wolves is a hate crime. You see? Love doesn't do what's easy. The author admits writing this piece to ask what makes transgender identity different from these other deeply perceived identities, some of which have been documented to produce deep personal pain. If we can agree that it is far from ideal to mutilate healthy bodies to accommodate someone who just thinks that they are transabled, then it is far from ideal to do the same for someone who identifies as transgender. They are thinking they're a girl or a boy. And if we can agree that it is far from loving to affirm someone's false sense of reality, then we can agree to continue to work towards finding positive cures for transgenderism rather than affirming a Bruce as Caitlin